provide more than 3 points. And I noticed in the commission study that's how you summarized and you came up with 3 main points. I'd like to delve into 2 of them, if I may, just very briefly, if I can get to them. They were 6 and 7, as I recall of them, so I'll go through it quickly. The commission recommends integrate digital and media literacy as a critical element of education at all levels through collaboration among federal, state, and local education officials. 7 was recommendation 7, fund and support public libraries and other community institutions as centers of digital and media training, especially for adults. Now, I want you to put the word archives in there someplace. Everybody make sure that we bring archives into this context. And taking those 2 sort of study issues, I'd like to pass around 2 images which, if I published them, I would be in violation of copyright. And the first comes from a really remarkable exhibit at the Metropolitan, which is called American Scenes of Everyday Life. And the book, which I all encourage you to buy because I scanned it from the book. The book is American Scenes, which is published by Yale University Press. And what it basically is a wonderful look at the art of portraying American scenes throughout, from basically 1840 to 1910. Now, I'm focusing on this one image because we're supposed to be talking about newspapers, and Richard Caton Woodville, who painted this, is probably one of the best individual painters who really tried to look at the dissemination of the news in the context of the community. And he did so with a certain amount of humor, a certain amount of commentary on racism. There's rather interesting. And he is also a Marylander from Baltimore, so I thought maybe that would be worthwhile as well. But it is this communication, and this communication to community, which I'm interested in. And I'm interested in it not just from the standpoint of the larger community. I think we ought to talk about that basic underlying research community too. The communication of knowledge and the maintenance of that knowledge within the context of a global digital world. So that brings me to my second piece of paper I'm going to pass around. This is a Jefferson letter that went underground. And basically what happened was it was discovered in an attic of a building in Maryland, again, of course, in Cecil County. And it was discovered up in the attic among some other papers. And this is a struggling little house restoration project where they said, oh my God, we got a Jefferson letter here. This is going to be worth a fortune. So they called me up and said, would I come in and tell them how much value this letter has? And I actually shared this with the people here at the time we did it. It's 2002. Keep in mind, it's before Princeton has published volume 34 and 35 of the Jefferson Papers, because this letter dates from 1801, all right? And it dates from July 2nd, 1801, and it's the only letter that Jefferson writes on that day. And it's a letter that Jefferson writes to the Baptist Association of Delaware. Now, everybody knows about the letter he writes to the Baptist Association of Connecticut, which is about 6 or 8 months later, but nobody knows about this letter to the Baptists of Delaware. So I go up and I take a look at this letter, and I say, oh my goodness gracious, they really do. What interests me is context, and I want to come back to context because that's what's been lost. Okay? It's been lost in volume 34 of the Jefferson Papers. We turned, the people who found this letter turned it over to Christie's. A very good catalog entry was written with regard to its provenance and its history, and it sits today on Christie's website. So if anybody wants to go and see what this guy did with the research I gave him relating to this particular letter, please go ahead and do that. Because what he tells you in what he sells, which is this piece of manuscript, is that the letter's fascinating, but it came wrapped in the instructions to the local editor to publish it in the newspaper. And it came wrapped in the original letter that elicited the response from Jefferson because the Baptists wanted it printed in the local newspaper. And then comes the next question. Well, if it was published in the local newspaper, how many other newspapers was it published in? All right? Well, you would go, and I'll take you on the research journey. You can go to the American Antiquarian Society. You can look at their newspaper project. But guess what? You won't find the newspaper there that was published in first, because the only run of that newspaper that exists is on microfilm at the University of Delaware in the Delaware Library. And they've never incorporated it into the American Newspaper Project. What was wrapped around that particular Jefferson letter was an indication of how the actual local editor managed the news. He doesn't publish it until September 9th, and it shows up in a wonderful newspaper, which I really want to make sure I get the, yes, it's called the Mirror of the Times. And of course that's what news is all about, which is the Mirror of the Times. And yet, it's a newspaper for for which we cannot get access to, because it has not put into even the biblical, well, that's not fair. Clarence Brigham has it in his bibliography of newspapers. But what happens to the letter? Christie sells it for $228,000. It's privately owned. Probably, I know who buy, because it was bought in the New York area, and there are only a few collectors who can afford to pay $228,000 for a different letter. But for me to use it as an image, I have to get permission from the owner. I don't have copyright privilege. So let me just pass this tour around. Where does that lead me to the more general issues? And I'd like to go,
Is this illegal?
What?
You know,
Yes.
no, it's a manuscript.
Just don't touch it.